It is April 5th, 1862. George B. McClellan of the United States Union Army has begun already his Peninsula campaign. It started off down in Fort Monroe in Virginia, and he's made his way up with his army of roughly 100,000 men, and he figures he's going to be going up against 100,000 men. And he lays siege to an old patriotic symbol of a town where Americans during the Revolutionary War finally were able to become victorious over the British. The Confederates will reinforce these earthworks at what is, even today's standards, a sacred site. And where we are today is at Yorktown. Yes, the famous Yorktown where Cornwallis surrendered and Alexander Hamilton led a famed assault on Redoubt 10, and the French took Redoubt 9 with so few casualties. We are back here at Yorktown because Yorktown, 81 years later after the surrender of Cornwallis, would again see heavy fighting. Now, unbeknownst to McClellan, there's roughly between 11 to 35,000 Confederate soldiers just here at Yorktown under Magruder, who there's a fort named after him up by Williamsburg where there's some heavy fighting. And here at Yorktown, he's going to have that force of 11 to 35,000. McClellan is going to highly overestimate how many soldiers he's up against with his Union Army. He believes that the Confederates have over 100,000 men strong, nestled and held up in Yorktown. And he doesn't want to take any chances, which is, from what it seems, he does this a lot during the Peninsula campaign. But while he's here, he has his army advance and lay siege again on Yorktown. And what I'm trying to get an understanding is what is going through these men's mind on both sides when they're either being besieged or laying siege, how they felt repeating what had just happened 81 years prior, a whole different lifetime ago, a whole couple generations before them. And that's what I kind of want to get into today about the Battle of Yorktown, or the Siege of Yorktown during the Civil War. Now, currently as I walk, I'm right behind the visitor center, which is over here, and more towards the Victory Monument over there. But I couldn't help but notice a sign that said, the earthworks of the British have been reinforced by the Confederates during the Civil War. So these earthworks, either reconstructed or reinforced, you can see it goes a little deep in there. of that work. I'm not a historian or anything. I would just assume, yeah, that's a reinforced Civil War fort now, or fortification. And then down there, all along here, are reinforced earthworks as well. Just wanted to point that out. What we're coming up to is Secretary Nelson's house, or at least what's left of it, the foundation. And I believe it burned down not too long after the start of the siege of Yorktown. And this is what it looked like. And this is where it stood, where that marker is. But this sign over here is what helps point me in the direction I'm trying to figure out. So the old town which you enter here is ringed by stout Civil War entrenchments built on top of the British works of 1781. Englishmen, Scotsmen, Welshmen, Hessians, and Loyalist Americans were quartered here while besieged by French forces under Washington. So now I'm also being besieged by Union troops as well as the old French American. Now getting here, there are at least two other bits of earthworks or fortifications or even redoubts, you could call them, along the way getting here of where I came from in Williamsburg. And they have Civil War trail signs about them, and they kind of talk about what took place in those areas, and that's where we're going to go. Now, I gotta say, I'm outside from where I just was. I wanted to point out just how large these earthworks are. Sorry for the bit of a shakiness. My gimbal is a little low on battery. But I wanted to come around here and show just how deep these trenches and how steep the fortifications are. And how much of a problem that would have been if the siege of Yorktown would have actually been as bloody as it could have been. Now, I've come across the Civil War Trail sign, and it says here, the founding fortress of York, the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. There's a earthwork right there through the trees. I want to take a quick read of this first, because it has a really good story here that I got to say that I was talking about by the Eugene Nash, 44th New York Volunteers. But we'll talk about here first. It says the trench line to my right is all that remains of a formidable line of Confederate earthworks that once blocked this historic road and the Union armies advanced westward past Yorktown in 1862. The Confederate defensive works surrounding Yorktown, which could be seen from this spot in 1862, still exist in a relatively untouched state. On April 5, 1862, the Army of the Potomac's Third Corps advanced against Yorktown, hoping for a victory to end the Civil War, just as General George Washington's victory here 81 years earlier had ended the American Revolution. They traveled along the York-Hampton Road, the same route used by British forces to surrender to Washington's army in 1781. With projections of over 100,000 troops holding the Confederates' massive earthworks, Major General George B. McClellan, USA, decided to besiege Yorktown. While minor skirmishing engagements between field batteries occurred almost daily, most of the Union Army's efforts were on building siege works. By May 3rd, more heavy artillery was aimed on Yorktown than had ever been massed in a single spot to that time in world history. And that night, General Joseph E. Johnston, CSA, who in mid-April had assumed command of the Confederate forces, decided his troops could not withstand the Union bombardment and withdrew his forces. On the morning of May 4th, the Army of the Potomac took possession of Yorktown, retaining control of the area for the remainder of the war. And this is what the rebel fortifications looked like at Yorktown. Now it says here by Eugene Nash of the 44th New York Volunteers, it did not seem possible that both armies could gather inspiration from the historic memories that cluster around this memorable field. The traditions of the Revolution lingered here, awakening in all loyal breasts sincerest hopes for the future. Yeah, I just got done filming for Yorktown the other day, and the the feeling of solemnness and everything, and and, and patriotism filled me like it does every time I go to a battlefield. And I can only imagine what these soldiers would have felt. And I got a little help there from Eugene Nash. These are some of the earthworks here as I walk. But I can only imagine just how many men felt the same way, how many soldiers felt the same way. And here we're going to come up onto this earthwork through the woods. Here we're at the earthwork that the sign was talking about. And you got to be a little careful because there's the road. I'm not trying to step on any property. But this is one of the few earthworks scattered throughout Yorktown that are still here today. And this was here for the Civil War. This was built by Confederate forces during the Civil War. Now, I don't know if it saw any action. There's nothing stating on it, but there were skirmishes, as the sign said, the uh, throughout the area during the siege. And who's to say that this fortification didn't see any action? Now, what's difficult to fathom as I think about this earthwork here, there isn't much written down about Yorktown uh, during the Civil War, from what I can understand. Seems to be glossed over a lot, especially in the books I've read and seen. It's just usually just puts it as, oh, there was a siege and that was it. But still human emotion, still human interaction, and pretty much that's what war is. And Yorktown holds a significant ideology, significant wave of emotions when you think about it, especially as an American. So we're going to go to the next one. That way, it's at least to be shown that there's other earthworks. Now, a bit further down, I've come to what's called End View, and it says here that this traditional farmhouse, which is right here, I believe, because that's a photo of it, with some folks sitting outside. It says this traditional farmhouse is probably built for William Harwood around 1769. His great-grandson, Dr. Humphrey Harwood Curtis, acquired a plantation in 1858. In May 1861, Dr. Curtis organized the Warwick Beauregard's Company, H. 32nd Virginia Volunteer Infantry Regiment and commanded them until May 1862. Confederate Generals Lafayette, McClellan, and Robert Toombs used Enview as their headquarters during the early stages of the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. Union regiments camped here as part of the Federal occupation of nearby Yorktown. Dr. Curtis regained possession of Enview, also called Curtis Farm, after the Civil War, and his descendants continued to live here until 1985. So that would be Enview down there. And this is the photo here, Civil War Trails sign. This is Dr. Humphrey Harwood Curtis, and I believe that would be his wife, Maria. It says here the 2.5-story frame building in front of you is in the distance is Enview. Enview was built circa 1760 by Colonel William Harwood Jr., who was a member of the House of Burgesses, a signer of the Virginia Resolves, and a Warwick County militia officer. When the French-American Army began its march to begin the Revolutionary War's siege on Yorktown on September 28, 1781, Major General Thomas Nelson Jr.'s 3,000-strong Virginia militia used Enview as a campground. Because of its location at a midpoint between the James and York Rivers, Enview once again served as an important militia muster point and campground during the War of 1812. When the Civil War erupted, Enview was owned by Dr. Humphrey Harwood Curtis. Dr. Curtis organized local volunteers into the Harwood Beauregards, accompanying each 32nd Virginia Volunteer Infantry at Enview, and was elected the unit's captain. Enview became a major campground and hospital for Confederates during the early stages of the Peninsula Campaign. Once the Southern Army withdrew from its Warwick River Yorktown defenses, the Union Army occupied Enview and used the building as a hospital during the May 5, 1862 Battle of Williamsburg. Then we have Lebanon Church, early picture of it. Historic Lebanon Church, located behind you at the intersection of two strategic highways, served both the Confederate and Union armies during the Civil War. Soon after, Confederate Colonel John Bankhead Magruder began organizing the Peninsula's defenses at Yorktown on May 21, 1861. Elements of the 3rd Virginia Cavalry established a courier station here. Countless Confederate soldiers marched by here between April 5th and May 3rd, 1862, to fill Magruder's trenches. 3 lines of fortification blocked Union General George B. McClellan's advance from Fort Monroe. The strongest line stretched 12 miles from Mulberry Island on the James River and followed the swampy Warwick River to within a mile of Yorktown. Captain Richard H. Adams, Jr. of the 5th Alabama Infantry wrote, "We took up a line of march for Lebanon Church, a very disagreeable one, too. Stayed about 2 hours in the rain, marched to Lee's Farm, General Magruder's headquarters. The Confederates abandoned their lines and marched by here in their retreat to Williamsburg. On May 4th, the day before the Battle of Williamsburg, Union Generals William F. Smith and Winfield Scott Hancock established their headquarters here. Federal troops occupied the area afterward, and the 5th Pennsylvania Cavalry used this church as a stable until 1863. The troopers burned the floors for firewood, removed bricks from the walls, and partially destroyed the roof." So here we have Lebanon Church, where we're at right here, and then Lee Hall. And we're that far from Yorktown, but they came out all the way here. We're at one of the furthest points of the defensive line for Yorktown itself. And it's over here. We have 2 earthworks from the Civil War. So I believe this is all private property too. So again, staying within my boundaries. I want to give the respect. But yeah, we got these 2 earthworks here. Now, what's also crazy to think is that not only was there Revolutionary War activity here, but there was War of 1812 activity here. So this area had 3 instances where it saw some type of war, or it was used during a war. You know, the Revolutionary War, as we read, War of 1812. Not many people know much about the War of 1812. Not many people read about the War of 1812. So, like, this is actually pretty cool to me. And then this was then again used like 50 years later as a site for Civil War activity. Uh, it doesn't say there was any kind of skirmishing here, so I doubt this area saw any kind of action. It was a courier post, uh, but I guess mainly McClellan was going after the actual Yorktown itself. But yeah, that's kind of pretty cool to see that the house is still here in the background, right there, and you got these earthworks right here that I am now somewhat in between right here and right here. So that's pretty cool to know. And knowing that, that's half the knowledge. That's half the battle, is just knowing. And now I get to show it to you. Now behind me I have the British earthworks during this Revolutionary War. And Magruder did reinforce them for the Civil War. He made a long line from the Jamestown River, or the James River, all the way to here the York River, or one of the rivers. He made a really long line and of entrenchments, and the Yorktown defenses were part of that anchor. But I sit and I think, well, I don't sit, but I walk here and gaze about me the grounds of Yorktown, and it's hard to imagine that not only the Revolutionary War was fought here, but there were Civil War soldiers here too, as part of the defenses of, again, Yorktown. And I can only imagine that both sides felt a patriotic fervor. When your breasts fill with that warm feeling of patriotism, the proudness and the pride, and just all nothing but patriotic feelings. And also at the same time probably fearful, or maybe a little bit of deja vu, or maybe some nostalgia that they yearn for an old pastime they never once experienced, but they get to re-experience it in their own way. That's what I'm trying to get at. There isn't much documentation written on Yorktown, but I do have a book with me to help kind of discuss the, not oddity, but just the easiness of how Yorktown was taken over. It was a month-long siege between two armies, one with overwhelming numbers. But if it wasn't for McClellan feeling like he was facing a larger army, it probably would have been a much quicker siege. But we're going to get to that right now. I also got to say, walking these lines, you got the National Cemetery right there at Yorktown, where Civil War soldiers are buried, right in between the lines. symbolism that even Waffles pointed out in our Yorktown video for the Revolutionary War. It all converges here. With the Peninsula campaign, it never really would have happened until Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy. The original capital of the Confederacy was, I believe, in Alabama. I believe it was Montgomery or Mobile. But had it not moved, the Peninsula campaign probably never would have happened. Because, like most wars, if you take the capital, you win the war pretty much. And you take away that patriotism, that, you take away the symbol of hope. But those are all what ifs. I don't play what ifs. It's just crazy to think about. So, let's get to that book. Now, I have with me here today The Peninsula Campaign 1862 by Joseph P. Cullen, and it's the McClellan and Lee Struggle for Richmond. And I have this on loan with me today, thanks to Second Time Books, who are in Rancocas Woods in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And I want to read an excerpt from the book about Yorktown. It says here on page 42, the mud, however, was the least of General McClellan's worries. Upon his arrival, he was informed that the Confederates were drawn up behind a line of entrenchments from Yorktown across to the Warwick River. That's the river it was, not the James, the Warwick. Garrisoned by not less than 15,000 troops under command of General John B. Magruder. Actually, Magruder probably less than 10,000 troops at the time. Optimistically, McClellan informed his wife, "I hope to get possession of Yorktown day after tomorrow." Then he received a message informing him that one corps of about 30,000 men under McDowell's command had been detained for the defense of Washington and would not join him in the coming campaign. "It is the most infamous thing that history has recorded," he angrily informed his wife. This still left him with over 100,000 men, the largest army ever commanded by one man in the history of the Western Hemisphere. But he immediately wired the Secretary of War that it would now be necessary to resort to the use of heavy guns and some siege operations before we assault, and accused the administration of not supporting him. It seems clear that I shall have the whole force of the enemy on my hands, probably not less than 100,000 men, and possibly more. In a long answering letter, the patient Lincoln tried to explain the facts of life to McClellan. He told him politely that his accusations about not being supported, while they do not offend me, do pain me very much. Then he stated emphatically, my explicit order that Washington should, by the judgment of all the commanders of Army Corps, be left entirely secure, had been neglected. It was precisely this that drove me to detain McDowell. All of this, of course, was not lost on McClellan. He did not regard his commander-in-chief's words as orders or even advice, merely arrogant interference in an attempt to block his success and thus ruin him politically. History will present a sad record of these traitors, he wrote, who were willing to sacrifice the country and its army for personal spite and personal aims. And despite the almost desperate plea by the president for immediate action, McClellan had no intention of abandoning his siege operations in favor of an assault. As he explained to his wife, he would attack Yorktown only when he could do it successfully by siege with heavy guns. But I don't intend to hurry it. I cannot afford to fail. I may have the opportunity of carrying the place next week, or may be delayed a couple of weeks. It didn't seem to matter one way or another. To McClellan, he was happy in the belief that he was avoiding the fault of the Allies at Sebastopol and quietly preparing the way for great success. We're back again because it fell over. And to continue, on page 45 actually, I'm sorry, 44, says, regardless of whether or not he intended to make the move on Gloucester Point, McClellan insisted he could not make it without Franklin's division of McDowell's Corps, about 12,000 men. Franklin and his division are indispensable to me, he telegraphed Stanton on April 10th. The fact that Franklin was a personal friend of his might have had something to do with it also. The worried Lincoln decided to give him what he wanted. However, in the so we're back again, but in a different position because of the wind. And we're going to continue on page 45. He said, regardless of whether or not he intended to make the move on Gloucester Point, McClellan insisted he could not make it without Franklin's division of McDowell's Corps, about 12,000 men. Franklin and his division are indispensable to me, he telegraphed Stanton on April 10th. The fact that Franklin was a personal friend of his might have had something to do with it also. The worried Lincoln decided to give him what he wanted. However, in the fond hope that it just might produce results. With the addition of Franklin's division, McClellan now had a total of 130,000 men, which he organized into 5 corps, commanded by Generals E.V. Sumner, S.P. Heintzelman, Erasmus D. Keyes, Fitz-John Porter, and William B. Franklin. I am delighted with Franklin's orders, he telegraphed, and beg to thank you. I shall make the movement I alluded to as soon as possible after he arrives. Needless to say, the movement was never made. A week later, he was begging Stanton, give me McCall's division, and I will undertake the movement on West Point, which will shake them out of Yorktown. That had always been his plan, he insisted, but he expected to have nearly 150,000 troops to carry it out. Now, with only 130,000, he could not do it unless he had McCall's division of McDowell's Corps. Otherwise, I must not be blamed if success is delayed. 2 days earlier, though, he had sent the president a confidential dispatch. After all that I have heard of things which have occurred since I left Washington and before, I would prefer that General McDowell should not again be assigned to duty with me. The same day he wrote his wife. So to continue on page 45, because my thing kept falling over. Now I've just reinforced it at the bottom. And so the days passed, rainy days, with McClellan slowly dragging his siege guns through the mud, digging gigantic entrenchments for them, until he had 114 heavy guns and mortars in position, ready to open fire on Yorktown. Then, on May 4th, the Confederates wisely withdrew up the peninsula towards Richmond. This, however, forced them to abandon Norfolk, the base of the Confederate ironclad Merrimac, and the dreadnought which had effectively blocked the James to the Federals and forced them to keep the Monitor in Hampton Roads. With its base gone, the crew of the Merrimac blew it up on the advice of the river pilots that could not navigate the treacherous channel up the James. The South had gained by McClellan's hesitation, however, as Lincoln had warned him. His delay had enabled the Confederates to build up their forces. When McClellan first landed on the peninsula, Magruder had less than 10,000 troops. But when McClellan resorted to siege tactics instead of assaulting, and the Confederate government was convinced that the landing was not just a feint, Johnston was immediately ordered down the peninsula to join Magruder, so that when he withdrew from Yorktown, he had in the neighborhood of 60,000 men, with reinforcements still coming into Richmond from the deep south. And then McClellan would send a column to go pursue the rebels, and then we'll get to Williamsburg. You see, it's because of this, luckily, I would have to say, we still have these lines here, because what would have happened had McClellan fired these siege guns upon Yorktown? The thing is, we will never know, nor would we have liked to have known and even thought that. But that's the Peninsula Campaign. It's widely brushed over, especially from an overview perspective. But for that, we will not have to worry. We still have our earthworks here from, the Revolutionary War, and we still have pretty much historical stuff here that we don't have to worry about ever having to lose from the Civil War, and I'm grateful for that. So one thing McClellan, in my eyes, did right. Now, McClellan, his fault and saving grace, in my eyes, is that he never assaulted. He wanted to lay siege, which tells me that he wanted to be like Washington, even though he calls himself Little Napoleon. He was so overwhelming the Confederates in numbers. It baffles me as someone who reads about these campaigns that he's part of, and he just slowly gets into the fray. He slowly and methodically attacks and lays siege, and it begins here in Yorktown. And he does it in Richmond, outside of Richmond, saying he needs more people, and it's his own fault. He pretty much shot himself in the foot. But as for the soldiers here, they're not paid, or they're not even ranked properly to even think about these kind of operations. They get to sit here and wallow in, the hardships of war, or they get to sit here and endure the hardships of war, be it, you know, moving around earthworks and, or, digging and stuff and fighting. But they also had the time to sit and think about the historical context in which they were actually based about. And for that, as I said, I believe that I would have probably felt some patriotic fervor, regardless of the side. I probably would have felt a little bit more uneasy being in the British lines than being the one laying siege. Not just because I'm overwhelmed, which I'm sure everybody knew, but it would have kind of played out as you're the British in this aspect, and the Americans are coming after you, even though the Confederates knew the land. They grew up here, and they were born Americans. They became Americans. They were, they're Americans all around. But I'm sure that's what went through their minds while they were sitting here behind the entrenchments and these lines around here. And then you had the Union, who felt like they were the conquerors, who were coming along Yorktown and these lines, that saw themselves as Washington and the French. So that patriotic fervor definitely probably running through everybody's minds. I can almost guarantee it, because everybody knows Yorktown. Every American knows Yorktown. Even today's standards, everybody knows Yorktown. So with that, I hope I enlightened you a little bit more on what took place here at Yorktown. Even though you see behind me Revolutionary War earthworks, they still served a purpose during the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.